Okay, so last week we finished off by looking at these three different types of oracles. Remember we said that the Old Testament prophets, when they spoke, there was a mixture of literature that they used. We said that when God speaks to the prophet, he normally speaks in prose, is the word, in non-poetry, just normal speech. But when the prophet relays the message to the people, most usually he's using poetry to do that. And so we have a mixture of prose and poetry in the prophets, and a bit of history as well. Especially in Isaiah, it tells us the little short snippets of history thrown in as well. And when we look at when the prophet is speaking to the people, usually in a poetic way, there are three main ways in which he delivers the message from God. Three different types of oracle that he uses. An oracle is like a small sermonette, a little sermon that he would preach, taking God's word to the people. We looked at announcement oracles and woe oracles last week, and I said that this week we'd pick up on the third one, covenant lawsuits. Still no sound. I can't even say it, sorry, because you can't hear me. Sorry. I'm recording it for you. Wish I knew sign language. Okay, thanks. So the third type of oracle that the prophet would use would be this covenant lawsuit that he would deliver to the people. And really what it is a courtroom drama that unfolds in the oracle, where God summonses the people to come and appear in a courtroom setting, and the accusation against them is that they have breached their covenant obligation. Remember we said that the prophets were covenant enforcement officers, CEOs, covenant enforcement officers. Their job was to come and call the people back to the covenant. These people were not free people. They might have been freed from Pharaoh, but now they were under God. They'd been freed from one Lord to now serve another Lord. They were now in contract to God. They had said, all that you say we will do. They'd said those words at Sinai. Everything God had called them to do, they said, we'll do it. We'll do it. And so they'd signed on the dotted line. They said, we will be your people. You will be our God. We will keep the covenant. And then they didn't. And so what God would do is send a prophet to call them back to the covenant. And this type of oracle is where he says to them, these are the areas that you've broken the covenant agreement with me. Now answer for that. And of course, like we saw right in the beginning, the great aim, the great goal was that they would repent and come back to the covenant and do what they had promised to do. And so these oracles, have I got an example for you there? Micah chapter 6. I think I printed it out for you, have I? I hope. Okay. Let's just read that together. Here's an example of a covenant lawsuit. Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So there's our example of a lawsuit. He starts off with God authenticating who he is. He establishes who he is in this drama. He says, listen, what does he say? Listen to what the Lord says. He reminds them of who he is. He is their Lord. And notice this in capital letters, Lord. That's always very important when you pick that up. That's God using his covenant name. He's not just a Lord, he is their Lord. He is the Lord who has bound himself to them in covenant. He is their husband. His name is Yahweh, Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Whenever you see that, it's translating the word Yahweh, his covenant name, his affectionate name. It's a bit like Belinda and myself. She calls me, don't laugh, Trej. Okay, hi Trej, how are you? It's a word that no one, I hope, here uses. Or if you do, don't let Michael hear. He'll never let me live it down. But you're not in a marriage relationship with me. But Belinda is, and she calls me that. Don't know why? Trej. It's like that. It's a reminder to me that this is my wife speaking. I have an obligation to her. She has an obligation to me. And so when God speaks to them, I am your Lord, with the capitals, he's saying, I'm your husband. You're meant to be faithful to me, and look at what you're doing. You're sleeping around, basically. You're running from God to God to God to God when you have committed yourself to me. Look what I've done for you, as he says. I've rescued you. You're mine. So he establishes who he is. He is their husband. He is the innocent party in all of this. And he summons his witnesses to come and listen to their answer. Who are the witnesses in this case? The mountains, the hills, the foundations of the earth, the created order. He says, your sin has been out there for all to see. The mountains have seen it, the hills have seen it. Creation has been looking on at you when you have been unfaithful to me. And so he calls the mountains and the hills, those who have witnessed their wrongdoing, he calls them to, obviously in poetic, explaining this poetically, or expressing it poetically. It's not like the mountains come waddling over, but what they've done is been there for everyone to see. And God calls creation to come and bear witness to what's been going on. So he calls the creative order to come and hear the case. And then he recalls in verses 1 and 2 his record of faithfulness. So he's establishing his innocence in this case compared to their guilt. So his record of faithfulness is absolutely blameless. He says, my people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? What is your problem with me? Why won't you be a faithful wife to me? What have I done that makes life so miserable for you that you go running off after these pagan gods? I brought you out of Egypt. I rescued you, redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you. I sent you a rescuer. Also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. And remember that little account? With Balak as this pagan king, and he calls Balaam, this mercenary, wicked prophet, to come and curse Israel. He says, you come and curse Israel. And so Balaam tries. He gets paid a lot of money. He tries, but he can't. Yeah. God says to him, you must say this to them. And he just reinforces the promises over 4 times. Balaam tries to curse Israel, but what comes out of his mouth is blessing and promise and promise and promise, getting actually more and more extravagant in the promises as he speaks more and more and more. And so he says, remember how these people try to plot against you. And remember what actually Balaam said, how Balaam answered. He answered with blessing when he was trying to answer in cursing. I protected you. I looked after you. Remember the journey, he says. Remember the journey. What journey is he talking about?
Excellent.
Yeah. Well, So the wilderness journey, remember? So how he provided for them. Every time they needed something, he provided it. Water, food, manna, quail, a protection from the enemies. He overthrew enemy kings who came up against Israel. Do you remember your journey, he says? We've come a long way together, is what God is saying. You and I. Remember the past, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. I have been righteous in every way. I've been righteous as a husband to you. So he's establishing his innocence in this case. Well, then it's their turn to speak. The defendant speaks in verses 6 and 7. And what do you make of their answer? Verses 6 and 7. This is how they respond to God. With what shall we come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves, a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruits of my body for the sin of my soul? What do you make of that reply?
I find it very flippant and rude. It's kind of in your face. Well, what do you want me to do?
Yeah, exactly. So what do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? It's like your kid. How dare you speak to me like that? God, God says, how have I burdened you? They say, we'll tell you how you burdened us. You're demanding sacrifices and oil and all of this stuff. It's kind of, they're saying, God, you're pretty demanding, actually. You make it very difficult to be your wife. You expect far too much from us, What do you expect? Must we come and bow down before you the whole time? As if you're God? It's like, yes, that's the answer, yes. But God actually didn't demand that from them. He didn't demand them to grovel. They were his people. Remember what he called them? My treasured possession. My treasured possession. They weren't slaves to God. They were slaves to Pharaoh. They had to grovel and bow down to Pharaoh, but God never called them to grovel. He just wanted them to love him. They're saying, all these sacrifices, must we come with all these burnt offerings, thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? God, it's all a bit much. You couldn't really have expected, What you're asking is too heavy for us. You've been really unreasonable in what you expect from this marriage, God. Is their answer. Amazing. Well, God replies then to them. And what is his answer to their grumbling? Through Micah. Yeah. God says, no, I don't want 10,000 rams. 1,000 rams and 10,000 rivers of oil. That was never the purpose, that you have to do stuff for me. I'm the one who's serving you, remember? Remember Jesus' words? I did not come to be served, but to serve. God doesn't want the rams for the ram's sake. He doesn't want the oil of incense for the oil's sake. He doesn't need that stuff. What does he need 1,000 rams for? God owns the cattle on all the hills, He doesn't need your sacrifice. He doesn't need your money. But it's good for you to give it. And it's right that you give it. And it's right that they offered sacrifices for their sins. God says, I'm not looking for sacrifice for sacrifice's sake. What I'm looking for is to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with me. That's what I'm wanting. That's what I've been looking for. In other words, you tell me, what has God been looking for? If not groveling and offering him all these sacrifices day in and day out. What does verse 8 describe?
Relationship.
Yeah, it's all relationship. He wants a relationship. God never started a new religion when he rescued Israel. It's not like he was starting a new religion. Leave your old religion and join my new religion. And instead of offering sacrifices to those gods, offer sacrifices to me. No. God's saying, I want something completely different. I don't want your religion. In fact, God hates religion. Religion is the opposite of grace. He says, I'm wanting a relationship with you. I simply want you to behave like my bride. I want you to be like me. That's what God is. He acts justly. God loves mercy. God is humble. And he says, I just wanted you to be my bride. I wanted a relationship with you. That's what I rescued you for. And how have they interpreted their relationship with God? Yeah, works. It's just impossible to please this guy. No matter how many I offer, he still wants more. No matter how much oil I bring, he wants more. It's just too much. Well, actually, God wasn't after any of their sacrifices. In fact, somewhere else he says, get these things out of here. I hate these things. Take them away. I don't want your sacrifices. The sacrifices weren't for me. The sacrifices were for you. It was good for you to sacrifice so that you could see the seriousness of your sin. When you cut that sheep's throat and the blood spills everywhere and the priest takes the blood and scatters it over the crowd, and you come home from church covered in blood, it's good for you. Why? Because that should have been you. I'm going to provide a lamb that's going to die in your place one day, Jesus. Because that's what you deserve. You deserve death. The wages of sin have always been death. The day you eat of it in the garden, you will die. And now you have to die, or something's going to have to die in your place. Hence the sacrifice idea that God introduces. It was good for them to sacrifice, to remind them of just how wicked they were and how dangerous a thing it was for them to live shoulder to shoulder with the holy God. It was good for them to sacrifice. God wasn't looking for sacrifice. He doesn't need blood. He doesn't like blood. Rochelle had a question. Is that alright? Is that alright? Does that make sense? I love these covenant lawsuits. We'll have a look at them and look at a few others.
And sorry, when he just in inverted commas what the Lord says, then he says, what shall I come before the Lord and bow down? That's not what the people responded. That's part of the prophecy, right?
Yes.
So he's saying this wasn't.
That's once. Great. You're over there.
Ja, es wird so
Yeah, okay. No. Could you guys see what I'm saying? Listen, what did she say? Hold that question. Remember, don't forget.
I missed the first part. No, last week's first session. First watching. No, you don't have to go on the website.
Okay. Right, so Joe had a question about the inverted commas.
That's not what the people said. So the prophet is just saying, what is he saying? Is he saying, if you say this?
Yeah. He's putting words in their mouth, I think. Yeah.
They didn't necessarily respond like that.
I think they were in their hearts. God knows what they're thinking. He knows their reluctance in this relationship and how grudgingly they are bringing the sacrifices. And so he tells them what they're thinking. It's a bit like Jesus had. Knowing what they were thinking in their hearts, Jesus said, I don't see in a shock, why do you say he is blessed when he heals the paralytic? Knowing what they were thinking in their hearts, i.e., who can forgive sins but God alone? Jesus said to them, what's easier, to forgive or to raise? Sure.
So I was just speaking about the question that I had earlier was that they weren't living under this covenant, they had to sacrifice.
Yeah.
So is God not hinting to my future?
Yeah. No, I think so. And even under the old covenant, it still was. Do you remember he only gave the law and the sacrifices after the rescue? After these people had become his people, he then gives them the law. And then only after he's given them the law does he give them the sacrifices. So can you see the order? He saves these people for himself. He makes them his bride. He brings them to Sinai. Sinai really is the signing of the register in a wedding. It's him signing the conditions. It's them signing the conditions, saying we are bound together in covenant. And then God says, right, so now this is how it's going to work. This is the rules of this relationship. And He gives them the law, which are very simple actually. It's just be like me. The Ten Commandments are just... yeah. The Ten Commandments are simply a reflection of who God is. God hates stealing, God hates lies, adultery, murder, etc. It's just... And God's saying, you are to be a holy nation. He's actually just telling them, people always say to me, oh, but it's so unreasonable for God to demand things from people that they can't deliver, when He knows they can't do that. Well, actually, that's not God's fault. They should have been able to deliver. That was how God, that's life as God intended it to be, without murder, without stealing. I mean, come on, is that excusable? No, it's not excusable. The problem is not the law or God. The problem is the people. And so God gives them the law, which has simply been how humankind is always meant to relate to God and always meant to relate to one another. Love God and love your neighbor. That's the way Jesus summarizes it. And then He gives them, after that, He gives them the sacrificial system, because He knows you can't keep it. So when you sin, then do this. It's very kind of God, so that you don't get killed for your sin. Here is a way to make atonement for your sin. Here's a way to, here's a big word, propitiate my anger. Propitiate means to take away my anger. So God's anger is transferred from the people to the sacrifice. Still no sound. Okay, thanks. Oh, there we go. So do you remember this? We even use the term today, a scapegoat. They'll say, oh, they made a scapegoat of the coach. In other words, he took the blame. Or the government might make a scapegoat of somebody. Really, that comes straight out of the Old Testament, where there was a scapegoat. And you would put your hand on the head of the scapegoat, and the scapegoat would be seen to have been the sinner. And that gets banished from the camp, sent out into the desert, taking the sins of the people symbolically out of the camp. It became what it was, the scapegoat. And so God gave him all of those things, the scapegoat, the sacrifices, all of that, to enable him to live amongst them and not kill them. Because all the time their sin was being atoned for, paid off. God's anger was being washed away the whole time by the sacrificial system, until Jesus comes along. And of course, he becomes the great scapegoat. Those are just symbols of what Jesus would really do, where God's anger is propitiated by Jesus. God's anger is taken and placed on God. Not an innocent third party, by the way, on the cross. It's not like there's a big problem between me and God, and so God grabs poor Jesus, sticks him on the cross and punishes him. No. That's what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe. There's a problem between me and God, so what does God do? He comes onto the cross and punishes himself. That's what's happening on the cross. He becomes that great sacrifice that the Old Testament was foreshadowing the whole time. Did I even come close to answering your question? I can't even remember your question, Michelle.
Sorry?
I can't even remember your question after that.
You asked it.
Have I?
It was about the covenant.
It's expected sacrifice, yeah. That's right. And so they were meant to sacrifice. It's a bit like us today. God expects honesty, so we should be honest, right? We know we're Christians, we know we're saved and redeemed, and heaven bent, not hell bent, heaven bent, and nothing's going to change that. That doesn't mean I can go and live however I like. I should actually be doing what God has called me to do. And so they had to do what God had told them to do, yes, but not in order to become God's people, but to stay God's people, or to remind themselves of who they were and how seriously they had violated the covenant. Okay. Have I got another one there for you from Isaiah?
Isaiah 3.
Excellent. Why did I not write that down here? Oh, yes, I have actually. So let's look up. I'm going to get an NIV. I take it that's what most of you have got. Is it easy? Yeah. Okay. Here's another one, another covenant lawsuit, Isaiah chapter 3. Let's see if we can work out the different parts of it. God will remind us who He is. He'll call witnesses to appear. He'll summon the guilty or the defendant. He'll lay charges, and then He will pass a verdict. Hopefully, we can see that from here. So let me read it. Isaiah 3:13 to 26. The Lord has taken His place to contend. He stands to judge peoples. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders and princes of His people. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord God of hosts. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, thinking with their feet. I love it. Therefore, the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. In that day, the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands and the crescents, the pendants and bracelets and the scarves, the headdresses and armlets and sashes, the perfume boxes and the amulets, the signet rings and the nose rings, the festal robes and mantles, the cloaks, the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans and the veils. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. Instead of a belt, a rope. Instead of a well-set hair, baldness. Instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth. And branding instead of beauty. Your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle. And her gates shall lament and mourn. Empty she shall sit on the ground. Well, there's a wake-up call, if ever there was one. Can you see how vivid it is when it's written poetically? I mean, God could have said, I'm going to send you in exile to Babylon. That's basically what He's saying. He's describing the exile. Babylon are going to come and crush you and take you away as prisoners of war for 70 years. But that's really boring. I mean, compare that to this. This sort of language really, really rams the message home. So God, again, it's the courtroom idea. He has taken His place to judge the peoples. He enters into judgment with the elders and the princes of His people. So those are the first people who have to appear before Him, the elders and the princes. And next it's the daughters of Zion as well, the daughters of Israel. And He lays charges against them. He says, this is my problem I have with you. You elders and princes, you have devoured the vineyard and the spoil of the poor. You have taken from the poor and put it in your houses. You have been exploiting the poor. You have crushed my people. You have ground the face of the poor. I love that language. You have ground the poor's faces into the dust. Absolutely mercilessly exploiting them, overtaxing them, taking their land, taking their harvests, grinding the faces of the poor. It's a lovely picture, isn't it? Well, it's an awful picture, but it's an amazingly expressive way of God laying the charge against the rulers and the elders, those who have responsibility over His people. They've been using their positions for self-gain, haven't they? And not just self-gain. I mean, they've really gone way overboard. And these are meant to be the people of God. He's not talking about some pagan nation here. He's not like accusing, Syria of doing this to Israel. He's accusing Israel of doing this to their own people. And then you daughters of Zion are haughty. You walk with an outstretched neck, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they are. What does that mean, mincing along? You ladies should know. Well, hopefully you don't. So otherwise it'd be the way my daughter walks down the passage. Mincing along, tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters. It's very, very vivid. Hey? Now, is it literal? Are they literally all going to end up with scabs on their heads? Not at all. Obviously not. This is poetry. But you get the picture, don't you? He's going to... all this beauty that they revel in and that they count so... has been so important God is going to replace, the perfume with the smells of rottenness. Instead of wearing these fancy belts, it is going to be a rope of a slave. Picture it's like being dragged along by a rope as a slave off to Babylon, which is what happened. You remember? Boney M. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept. Why? Because they've been dragged by the Babylonians off into captivity. Instead of the well-set hair, baldness. Branding instead of beauty. It's poetry. It's poetry, right? But it's showing this amazing contrast with life as it is compared to life as it's going to be if you're not careful. This is what's in store. And did they repent? Not at all, hey? Not at all. And the Babylonians did come. And they did drag them off as prisoners of war to Babylon for 70 years. They lived in Babylon. But when you can see it, when you can see these oracles and see the courtroom drama, for instance, or the woe oracle, or the announcement oracle, it really helps you to get a grip of what's going on and what God's complaint is with His people. And then, of course, we need to try and think, how does that translate to us today? In what way are we guilty of these things? Or in what way is it speaking to us about ourselves? Does that mean that we may not wear nose rings, Chantel? And, what is God saying here? What is the message for us today? And that's what we're going to have to get to in the next section. Right. So we get to section 4 now, which is the interpretation of prophecy. Hopefully we've understood what the prophets, or hopefully we can better understand what the prophets were saying. The question is, how do we interpret what they were saying? What is what they were saying to those people then got to do with me here now? Okay, this is the big link. How do we make the jump? How do we apply Old Testament prophecy to us today? So what is the relevance of Old Testament prophecy to New Testament Christians? And specifically Christians, Gentile Christians, living in the 21st century. Life is pretty different to what it was for them back then. So what we need to do is find the principles that still apply today. Obviously the detail often doesn't apply today, but the principles do. There might have been, there's all sorts of examples of things that God required of the Old Testament believer that He doesn't require today from us. I take it we didn't worry too much this morning about whether our clothes mixed nylon and cotton, for instance. That's outlawed in the Old Testament. A believer in God may not wear a garment made of two types of material, for example. A believer in the Old Testament may not plant, carrots and beans in the same garden. You may not have tattoos. You have to have a parapet around the wall, around the roof of your house. All these rules that don't apply today. But there were principles behind those rules that all still apply today. We've got to find the principle that was behind the particular rule, like nylon and cotton, and find how does that principle apply to Christians today. Otherwise we're going to become very, very legalistic. Coming in your all-cotton outfit every Wednesday. That's not what God's looking for. It's a bit like, the rivers of oil. God's not looking for rivers of oil. He's not looking for all cotton garments, for goodness sake. He's looking for a heart that's understood who He is, and a heart that loves Him. So what are the principles, especially in our very, very different cultures? Well, how do we find these principles? Well, we go to the Bible to find them. Surprise, surprise. We go and we look in the New Testament, because the New Testament apostles were sitting in a pretty similar position to us. At least they were still Jews. We're not Jews. I take it no one in this room is a Jew or from Jewish descent. They were Jewish, but they were sitting what? 500 years, 600 years after the prophets had written to a particular generation. These guys are now living in generations later. How do they interpret what the prophets said way back then? How did they interpret that to their present generations that they were preaching to? And so that's where we need to go. We need to look at how the apostles used Old Testament prophecy. And the first thing we notice is that there are multiple fulfillments of prophecy. When the prophet said something would happen, it was fulfilled in many different ways. You're going to soon see that as soon as you get to reading the New Testament and the way the New Testament uses the Old Testament. So the example I want us to look at is from Luke chapter 4, where Jesus himself, we're not even looking here at the apostles, but Jesus himself, how did he interpret the Old Testament prophets? So in Luke chapter 4, verse 16, there's a passage printed for you, I hope? Yeah, okay. So let's just read down the left-hand side there. He went, that's Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. So he's gone back to his hometown, where everyone knows him, basically, is what Luke is saying. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written. Okay, so he gets the scroll of Isaiah, which is an Old Testament prophet. So that really helps us if we're trying to understand how to understand Old Testament prophets. Let's see what Jesus does with the scroll. Jesus turns to the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." That was his sermon. Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. One of the shortest sermons ever preached. So there's this great build-up of anticipation. What is Jesus going to say? What is he going to say? And he says, a handful of words, and that's it. That's the end of the story. So what's really important here, and what's so interesting, is what Jesus chooses to read, and then how much he reads, and how little he reads. What exactly he reads is so important. And what I'm trying to do is arrange the passage that he read against the Old Testament scroll that he had in his hand. So he was reading from Isaiah chapter 61, where it says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." So that's the bit that he turned to. That's the bit that he read. But when we read it, we see what Jesus has done. He has stopped halfway through a sentence. Did you notice that? He breaks off and he says, "Okay, that has been fulfilled today in your hearing." But he should have carried on and read the rest, don't you think? I mean, who stops halfway through a sentence? Imagine if that was what the reader did on Sunday. Just, "For God so loved the world that he," and then sit down. No one reads like that. But look what he left out. Look what Jesus leaves out. He should have carried on to read, and not only to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, but also to proclaim the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort those who mourn, to provide for those who grieve. So what is Jesus saying by cutting off Isaiah mid-sentence? Yeah. He says to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." The words that I've read to you are fulfilled in your hearing. But the words that I haven't read to you haven't yet been fulfilled in your hearing. He stops at exactly the point where what he has come to do has been fulfilled, i.e., to set free, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of the sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. That's what Jesus came to do. And he says, that is what I've come to do, that is what I've done, that is fulfilled. Draw a line. I've fulfilled it. And today that has all come true for you. What is yet to happen? Well, what is yet to happen is the day of the vengeance of our God, which is going to produce widows who mourn, etc., etc., etc. A day of great wailing and tribulation. a day of great regret and loss. That's still coming. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, that hasn't yet been fulfilled today in your hearing. But a day is coming when that will be fulfilled. Yeah.
I understand how he says that he's fulfilled proclaiming the freedom of prisoners, recovery of sight, blah, 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 release of the oppressed, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favour.
Yeah. The year of the Lord's favour was the Jubilee year. So every 50 years, I think it is, was the Jubilee year.
And I have to forget all debts and all that.
That's right. You return all the land to the original families. You cancel all debts. You set all the slaves free.
So was that year that Jesus was
No, I don't think so. I might be wrong. But he's saying all of those Jubilee years were actually pointing to this day, when God is going to set the prisoners free, cancel the debts, etc., etc. God's cancelling his debt with you on the cross. Yeah. So Jesus is saying this part of Isaiah has been fulfilled now. It is not yet the time for God's vengeance. That still belongs to the future, is what he's saying. So in other words, do you get what he's saying here? We're talking about the multiple fulfillments of Old Testament prophecy. Isaiah spoke certain words to a certain people. And they were words for those people. They were words that came true in those people's lives, in their lifetime. But Jesus picks it up and he says, today those words are being fulfilled. They are still being fulfilled, he says. And in other words, by leaving some out, he's saying a day is coming when the rest will be fulfilled. So he's saying there's multiple, what Isaiah said was true for that generation. There was the Jubilee year where people were set free, etc. And Cyrus was the fulfillment of that prophecy, actually. When God promised to send a rescuer, someone to set them free. That was Cyrus, king of Persia, a pagan king. God says, I'm going to use Cyrus to set you free from slavery. And so what Isaiah said did come true for those Israelites then. Jesus picks up and says, yeah, but not completely. Cyrus could just set you free from physical slavery. I've come to set you free from spiritual slavery. It was what Isaiah said hadn't been completely fulfilled. I've come to complete the fulfillment. And a day is yet to come when what Isaiah said would happen actually happens in all its fullness. The vengeance, the day of vengeance of our God. And of course, we can see the day of vengeance of our God happening in all three times as well, can't we? So for the Israelites, when did the day of vengeance come on them? Yeah, when the Babylonians arrived, smashed them to pieces, took them off to exile. That was God's vengeance. It was very clear. They'd been warned and warned and warned that that day was coming, and it came. And God's vengeance fell on them, and they were exiled. So it was fulfilled, but not completely. Because when Jesus was around, that was also the day of God's vengeance. What do I mean by that? How was God's vengeance seen in Jesus' lifetime?
They were captured under the rule of Rome.
Yeah, that's right, but that wasn't the vengeance of God.
So let's take the question.
Where do we see the vengeance of God in Jesus' lifetime for that generation?
On Jesus.
On Jesus, yeah, on his death. The vengeance of God falls on Jesus. So the wrath of God, the anger of God, lands on Jesus. But a day is yet to come when the wrath of God is going to come on the world, isn't it? That will also be the day of God's vengeance. So we get 3 days of God's vengeance. We get three occurrences of God setting prisoners free. We get 3 occurrences of God sending a rescuer. Each prophecy that Isaiah preached, he wasn't being deceitful. It was for his people. It did come true in their lifetime, but actually not completely true. It got carried over till when Jesus came. And it didn't get completely fulfilled in Jesus' day either, because there are still some outstanding parts that are yet to come true, like the day of vengeance that is coming on the world. When what Nebuchadnezzar did to Judah was nothing compared to what God is going to do to the world. It was just a curtain raiser. It was just what do you call them when you go to the movies and you see the trailer? It was just a trailer of what's coming. All the judgments that you see in the Bible, Noah and the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, you can think of them, the exile, Babylon, The Romans smashing up the temple in 70 AD. Those are just trailers. Just warning us that this day of vengeance is yet to come, when those things will be nothing compared to God's fury being poured out on the world. And that is what Jesus came to rescue us from that day of fury that is coming. So, I've fallen a little bit behind here. But carried away, I forgot I had a PowerPoint. This pattern of partial fulfillment in the time of the Old Testament prophet, and then further partial fulfillments in the life of Jesus, and then full and final fulfillments on the day of second coming, that is really the pattern. That is the pattern that we use when we read the Old Testament prophecies. Whatever they said was for them, in a way. But it was also for Jesus, and then it's for us. And we've got to read all Old Testament prophecy like that. What did this mean for those people back then? What did it mean for Jesus? And then what does it mean for us? We've got to ask those three questions. Because otherwise we can't jump straight from what Isaiah said to me, sitting in the 21st century. You're going to make a hopeless mess of everything. You're going to be completely off track if you try and do that. You have to try and work through it. So that was the way Jesus interpreted Isaiah. I've got another example there, I think, which is how the apostles interpreted some of the prophecies from Joel. Have I printed that for you, Joel? Joel chapter 2. I'll give you the reference. It's a very famous passage, and Michael preached on it a little while ago. So Joel chapter 2. You might want to turn there, otherwise just listen, because it's very well known. You'll know it you'll recognize it when I read it. Joel writes, "Afterward I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will show wonders in the heavens and on earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, among the survivors whom the Lord calls." So that was a message from Joel to a particular audience, way back then. What was Joel talking about? But was he? You see what you've done? What have you done there? You've jumped, not as I do, from Joel to me. You've jumped from Joel to Pentecost. You forgot the first step. Joel to them. Because what Joel was saying to them actually came true for them. He's warning them of something that's going to happen to them, if not in their lifetime, or then in their children's lifetime. It's imminent. It's going to happen like now, says Joel, these things. We pick this up and say, I've heard this before. It's Pentecost. Yes, that's true. But it's not only Pentecost. It's not only Joel and his generation. It's not only Pentecost. It's also, when is the great and dreadful day of the Lord? Well, it's all three. It's all three. There was a great and dreadful day of the Lord in Joel's generation. There was a great and dreadful day of the Lord in Jesus' life. And there was a great and dreadful day of the Lord that we're still waiting for, that's coming. So can you see, we've got to be disciplined. We've got to actually go through the three stages and make sure we're understanding what the prophet meant originally by what he said. And then what he was talking about in terms of Jesus and Jesus' ministry. And then only then can we get to ourselves here today.
So how was it good? How did it happen in Joel's time?
I'm desperately trying to remember who Joel prophesied to, whether it was the north or the south.
It goes on to say, I will restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem.
So I think it was. We've got examples at the front. Joel to Judah. There you go, on page 73. So Joel was the prophet to Judah. And his was the disputed days, either 800 or 500 BC. So he was prophesying to the southern kingdom of Judah. And he was... It's before the exile, you see. And he's telling them of this great and dreadful day. And again, it's poetry, isn't it? It's poetry that he uses. Blood and fire and billows of smoke, the sun turning to dark and the moon being turned to blood. It's poetry. We're used to, aren't we, by now, I hope, reading poetry when we come to the Old Testament prophets. He's describing a cataclysmic and completely disastrous judgment coming from God on his people, but in poetic language. And it came, of course, in the exile. That's exactly what happened. The Babylonians came, and horror of horrors, absolutely destroyed Jerusalem. They besieged it for years to begin with, so much so that people turned to cannibalism. Do you remember Deuteronomy 18 or 28, where it promises curses on disobedience and mothers eating the afterbirth, and because things would be that bad, they would be that bad, and they got that bad. Why? Because these people wouldn't be faithful to God, and the curses that God promised came, just as the blessings also come to us when we put our faith in Jesus. As sure as the blessings come to you when you obey God, the curses will come on you if you disobey God. Next.
Do some cases still exist?
Sorry?
For people who don't know Christ, do some cases still exist?
Yes. I think not on them now. So there's a big movement in Christianity about the curses of the fathers being visited on the sons, and what's happening now is because there's a curse on my family. My father was a paedophile, or my grandfather was a whatever, and now I'm suffering the curses. I don't think that's true at all. Jesus has taken the curse on himself. He has broken the curse for the Christian. For the Christian, yeah.
But the rest?
I think that the curse he's talking about is coming at the end, where you will be cursed, cast away from God, to a place that Jesus calls hell. I don't think those curses and blessings were given, remember, to Israel. They weren't given on non-Christians. So they certainly don't apply to Christians, because Jesus has broken the curse. He has taken the curse on himself. And I don't think they apply to Gentiles, to pagans either, because they were never given to the non-covenant people of God. They were given to the covenant people of God. This is what's going to happen to you, my wife. That's what God's saying. My people, this is going to happen to you. It's a picture, obviously, of the final judgment that's going to happen to the whole world.
So would it then apply to Jewish people today?
Oh, that's a hard question. I don't know. That's the answer. Ask Michael. I think there certainly is I don't know what the term is even, but when you pick up a family trait, it just keeps going. Child abuse is an obvious one. You're abused, you abuse your child. It's just, and unless something happens to break that, I think it's just sociological. I don't think it's spiritual. I think it's just, you don't know any better. That's the way you're brought up. The sins of the fathers. But you see, that is, again, talking to believers. It's not talking to people out there in the world. But I think people out there in the world do pick up the habits of their fathers. But I don't think it's a result of a promise from God that that's going to happen to you. Because he wasn't talking to Gentiles at that point. So he doesn't visit the sins of my father on me, thank God. And thank God he doesn't visit my sins on my children. God doesn't work like that. But he's just saying that, the promises of God are meant to be passed down generation to generation within the Jewish nation. And just like the promises are blessing, so if you fail in your faithfulness to me, instead of blessing will come curse, and generation after generation after generation. That's what he's saying. He's saying, teach your children about me, basically. So the point is that we're trying to get back to these multiple fulfillments, and the pattern, the way that we must try and understand prophecy. What Joel said would happen did happen. It did happen. But then what Joel said would happen also happened in Pentecost. So Katie is absolutely right. It is Pentecost. It's describing, and that's exactly what Peter says. Hey, that's exactly what Peter stands up and he says. What Joel said would happen is happening in your very hearing here. It's as a result of Jesus' death and resurrection. So the prophets were always talking about two things, at least. What life would look like in their lifetime, and what life would look like when the Messiah came. Because when the Messiah comes, not only will the wrath of God be poured out on the Messiah, which they didn't realize back then, but also all of these other things. The sons and daughters prophesying, old men dream dreams, young men see visions. And people have gone to town on those verses. Even on my servants, men and women, I'll pour out my Spirit. That's the key thing. In the Old Testament, who did God pour His Spirit out on? No. The prophets were anointed. The kings. The kings received the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God came on the king to empower the king for his job. And the prophets to a certain extent. Obviously they preached in the power of the Spirit. But not the Israelites. You and I, if we had been Israelites, we wouldn't have known anything about this presence of the Spirit. Not at all. And who did God reveal Himself to through prophecy and dreams and visions? The Israelites? No. The prophets. That's why I think the revelation was for the prophets, the Spirit was for the kings. That was how it worked in the old order of things. It was the prophets who prophesied and dreamed dreams and saw visions. The prophets did that. The kings were those who had the Spirit poured out on them. But God is promising a day when those things will happen to common or garden Christians. Normal people will receive the revelation of God. They will know God. God will reveal Himself to them. And God will give His Spirit to them. Those things that were reserved for prophets and kings in the Old Testament will become blessings for all Christians. And Peter's saying, that is what you're seeing with your own eyes today at Pentecost. The Spirit has been poured out at Pentecost. It was when the Spirit of God arrived on earth. Jesus said, I must go and I will send the Spirit. I will send the Counselor. He will come, the Paraclete. And he was talking about Joel. He's saying, what Joel said would happen is happening right now in your presence. And the evidence there was the tongues at Pentecost. But of course, what Joel was also talking about was the day of reckoning. That great, as he calls it, and dreadful day of the Lord. That is still coming. And it's still true, isn't it? That on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance. In other words, in amongst the judgment, God is going to save. He's busy doing that today. And there will be, at the final day, that great and dreadful day of the Lord, there will be a bunch of people who call themselves Christians who will escape the flames, who will be spared the judgment, who will be pulled out of the judgment, just like Noah. The judgment fell on the world, but God preserved His elect, His loved ones. He preserved through the judgment. And that's what Joel is talking about. And so he's talking about these three great peaks that we have. So that's how we must read the prophets. We dare not jump straight from the prophets to us today and say, the moon's going to turn to blood any minute now. Okay? Number one, it's not literal, it's poetic. And number two, we haven't thought about what the prophets were saying to their own people. I mean, the moon turned into blood has always been a symbol of judgment of God coming. That did happen. The judgment of God did come on Judah. But he was also talking about the cross, when the moon was turned to blood. Not literally, but when God judged the sun. And the day is coming when the moon will turn to blood, i.e. God's judgment is going to fall again. In a full and final way. It fell partially here. It fell fully here for Christians. And it will fall fully here for non-Christians. We have been judged. Our judgment has taken place on the cross. It's a fait accompli. God's judgment has been used up. There is nothing more to pour out on you, because He poured it all out on Christ. And so we must go back and read the Old Testament, and particularly the Old Testament prophets, through the cross. Try and see how what they said was fulfilled in their lifetime, yes, but mainly on the cross. What they were talking about was the judgment of God falling on the cross, or falling on Jesus on the cross. wondering if I should do this quickly. I've got a couple of minutes, 2 minutes. If I can remember how to use this thing, probably not. I don't think I'll tempt fate. Let me share something with you that was really helpful for me when someone pointed it out to me. When you read the Old Testament, the question is, none of us are there. We are sitting centuries after the Old Testament, right? So when we read the Old Testament, we are looking back through time. And we're not looking back in a neutral way through time. All of us are looking back through time through a lens. It's like putting glasses on. And the question is, what lens are you reading the Old Testament through? What spectacles are you using when you read the Old Testament? Now, the Nazis and the apartheid theologians were using the lens of the Exodus. So both of them, and actually, ironically, the liberation theologians who were behind all the liberation movements in Africa and South America, they were all going and reading the Old Testament prophets through a lens called Exodus. They were looking at the situation saying, the Afrikaner would look and say, these dirty, rotten Englishmen, they're oppressing us, we're stuck here, we're almost slaves in South Africa, we need an Exodus. We are going to leave Cape Town on the Great Trek, and we're going to head to the Promised Land, the Transvaal. And the Vaal River became the Jordan. They crossed over the river, and it was very symbolic, and they went into the Promised Land. And they counted themselves as God's chosen people. So much so that, years and years later, they thought that they were God's chosen people, and that black people were like the Canaanites. Exterminate them, get rid of them. The Nazis did exactly the same thing. They said, we are under the oppression of the West after the First World War, all the war penalties they had to pay. Germany is in a really bad way. We need an exodus. We need liberation. Just like the Bible talks about God's chosen people and God rescues people. And so did the liberation guys after the Afrikaner had power. They said, this is ridiculous. We are prisoners here. We are being oppressed by the Afrikaner. We need an exodus. We need a savior. We need a Moses. So Peter, Tifo, Maritz, they become the Moseses for the Afrikaners. The Nelson Mandelas and the Steve Bikos become the Moseses of the black liberation movements and the South American liberation movements. They've all used the Old Testament to justify what they're trying to do, fighting for freedom, quest for freedom, the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, all those. This comes out of the Old Testament. And the problem, the mistake they're all making is they're reading the Old Testament through a lens called Exodus. What we need to be as Christians is reading the Old Testament through a lens called the cross. We must be reading the Bible through the cross, not through the Exodus. Otherwise, we are going to try and get economic freedom and freedom from sickness and freedom from poverty and freedom from all these oppressors. And we want the Promised Land in this life, in this world. No. We must read the Old Testament through the lens of the cross. That on the cross, Jesus was delivering us from slavery, from death, from all those things. And the Promised Land you're not going to find on this planet. The Promised Land is the world to come. It's the life to come. The creation that's yet to come. We're going to make a big mistake if we read the Old Testament through the wrong lens. We've got to keep the cross at the center of the way we read the Bible so we don't go wrong. Think about it. Come back to me next week. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Andy.